Alright, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial on how to upload your high poly sculpts to Sketchfab and present them in an awesome fashion. Without making an overly long intro, let's just continue to the next point. So, the next part in this tutorial would be to show you how you can set up your sculpting in a very great manner without using any textures. So this is one example what I'm talking about. This model by Rest Thoughtless, which I really love, is basically just a sculpting from ZBrush, also decimated to a manageable degree, and then just every texture input is blank except for the vertex color. He did just some poly painting, uploaded that to Sketchfab, and this is the model with no post-processing, and this is the model with post-processing. And this is it. And this is what we're trying to do next. We can also make something without vertex colors, like this model by Artcraft, which is really nice. Just this high poly upload. Very much less decimated, but still enough to have all the detail in there. There's no normal maps, nothing. Just every input is empty, and this is it, just a bit of lighting and post-processing. So this is what I want to show you next. So to show you how we are going to do this, I will use this model, which is like over 2 years old, which I did for, I think it's my first entry for the weekly CG challenge back then. And basically what it is okay, I did retopologize it, so it has a much more cleaner topology, but I am going to use no textures, nothing, except for some vertex paint or poly paint, depending on which program you use. So the procedure is pretty much the same. Just make sure that the model is ready, everything is applied, all the transforms, there are no normal issues, and the poly count is manageable. Also create some UVs if you must, but with this, I'm just going to use it like that. Also, another thing that I did is I did apply some materials to it because the hair is definitely going to be more translucent. The crown has more of a metal feeling. Also, the jewel has its own material, and the clothing will be a bit more solid. And also the skin is different. So all of these little things have different materials. So just export this as an FBX and then upload it to Sketchfab, which I already did. So this would be my uploaded model, which I just dumped it down. I already did this before, but I'm just going to go through all the points. This is basically the goal of this upload. I did also this upload within like one evening to make it really quick. I wanted to make this as fast as possible, and I did some fixes and some more tweaks after that, but this was also made with the intention, okay, I want to make this really quick. Can I do it? And apparently you can. If you have it uploaded, the material settings are not that difficult to pull off. So I have everything uploaded in here, and the first thing that we're going to do is go over the PBR settings and stuff like that. So for the general settings, I just use 50 degrees, which is like the safest thing that you can do. It should usually always look good. Also, I did some orbit limitation, which you don't have to do. Then if you upload the vertex colors, you also have this extra option here where you can apply the vertex colors to the model, which usually is only applied for the diffuse color. Here you can also choose like if it's linear or sRGB. In my case it's sRGB. And also same thing with the environment. I just picked a singular color and that's it. With the lighting, I picked this Studio HDRI. did like a little orientation and brightness adjustment, left the shadows off, and then I started making a rim light, which is just this bluish, purplish, pretty bright light attached to the camera with a shadow bias, so it casts... Oh, it actually casts no shadows, so keep that off. And then another thing that I added is like a key light that comes from the right. This doesn't follow the camera. It's just put in place there. Also, let me just go over the materials real quick, show you. I don't want to have the translucency in there for this to show off the lighting. I just have the key light in here, and the last thing I added was a spotlight. Not really as an extra rim light, but this was added later. This I added later on, specifically for the hair, because it's the most translucent material, and I wanted to have some light really go through that. I can leave it off for now. And what I did with the materials is basically, if I go through them, I didn't use the vertex color for the skin that much. I added some extra base color in there. I made it a bit more colorful, cranked that up to 100%, metalness to 0, and just a bit of glossiness. Everything else is off except for face rendering single-sided, and then I added some subsurface scattering, which also translucency, which adds this little bit of extra fill light. Like, it really gives a bit of nice material reaction to it. It's not perfect because it's real time, but it still works. Of course, you don't have to do it. This is just for my experiment. I wanted to play around with the subsurface and volumetric settings a bit. But I did this pretty much for every material. Just went through this, added like a little bit more color maybe, set the specular, metalness, glossiness, and everything else is off because we don't have any textures. Single-sided, and added subsurface scattering. And the gold, this has a lot of metalness applied, of course, and is a bit more specular. And everything else is off. No subsurface scattering because gold doesn't subsurface scatter. And then the hair. The hair, I just also got some extra color in there because the standard was a bit too pink. I wanted to have it a bit more reddish. And then some glossiness settings, single-sided, and a lot more transparency and translucency. Not transparency, subsurface scattering and translucency. Which, yeah, you can also just play around with these settings. It's pretty simple. Also make your own little color profiles for the subsurface scattering, and maybe even plug in some textures if you have some. And also for this translucency, I just picked this really pink, like reddish color, and thickness factor. You can play around with that as well, and just see what it has on the result. And because I also don't know how every one of these settings works out so specifically, just experiment a bit. And for the jewel, I also just created some extra blue on it. Added some translucency, I think. No, I didn't. Why is this on? And also subsurface scattering and translucency here. And that's pretty much it. And then I added this extra light, yes, and now you can see what the translucency does. And I did this entire setup in pretty much, I think 10 minutes, 15 minutes, just playing around a bit and then tweaking the colors. And then I added some more post-processing, and especially like the filmic settings really give some extra make it so much more appealing to the eyes. The main thing I'm usually fighting with the filmic settings in terms of contrast and exposure and stuff like that. I just crank that up a bit more just to get the right feeling for it. Also some bloom added in and an extra vignette. Also be careful with the bloom that you don't make the threshold too high or the radius or like the intensity. Keep it just subtle enough. This is already pretty high, but it works for the model with the thing that I wanted to do. And just using vertex colors for the model already makes stuff much more easier, especially if you're just sculpting it in ZBrush and upload it, just decimate it, and then if you can directly just use the vertex colors to your advantage. That is so helpful and can just add so much more appeal to the model on Sketchfab. And if you're done, just pick an angle that you like, double click on the model to have the rotation point right, that you are rotating around the model and not just off to the side or something. Just click on it, double click, angle it right, and save view to make a thumbnail, and then save settings. I'm not going to save settings because this is an already pre-existing model, but you get it. And then you can just, let's exit, and then you have it, and that's it. And this entire model I uploaded in it was 50 minutes, 40 or 50 minutes, then I had it. And if you're in a hurry, if you're going to do this for SculptJanuary, I don't know if you want to, you can do it on a daily basis, especially if you have a standard workflow worked out. If you know how you're going to handle this, you can do it very quickly and efficiently. The only thing I would wish that would be here is to copy drafts, to make a model unpublished and copy it, but you can't do that. So you have to set it up every time again and again, which is a bit tedious, but if you know the settings by then, it just becomes second nature, I guess. Just pick up the muscle memory and just do it again. And that's pretty much it for this part. Just remember, for the lighting, you are having a much easier time if you're sticking to a 3-point lighting setup. Just try something out, maybe with a model that you already have, and just experiment a bit. And you can just repeat the steps for the next models. And let's move on to the next point then. Okay, so the next part and the last part would be to dissect and show you how I exactly did this lighting setup. Or also this one, another model that I did recently for Sketchfab, which is pretty much a step up in terms of lighting. Also, this is still really fast to do. This is really maybe even easier, because what I basically did in this with these models is I created just a baked texture from the lighting setup that I already had set up in Blender. So I lit this model this way and just baked this into the model as a diffuse color with, of course, the normal map, and then use the diffuse color also as an emission map. So that way we can just fake this pre-made lighting setup, just having all the highlights and shadows in there, and the only thing that's going to be rendered in real time in Sketchfab is going to be the specular aspect of the model. And that's why when I rotate the lights, you can see the model reacts based on the normal map and the geometry on a specular level, but all the diffuse lighting and everything else just stays put, which is pretty unrealistic. But if you're just looking at it this way, just rotating around, it is convincing enough. you don't really notice it that much. It doesn't really look that fake. And that is exactly what I want to show you, how to set up this and do it as quick and as efficiently as possible. So let's get into it. So at this point, I'm just going to take this model that we already did previously and just move on from there. So I originally had made the sculpt, but I also used a pre-made lighting setup and material that I reused for all of my sculptings that I made this month. And I am going to show you how you can do the exact same way for Sketchfab. So I basically have this material, this clay material. Oh, wait. Let's go to CPU. And if I render this, you can see the model. Sorry if it's that it's so slow. It's just on a... I'm not on my working PC right now. So basically what I did, if I pull this over here, I used this lighting setup that I had for this render that I made back then. I went into the material and killed all the specularity. Just made it completely diffuse. There's still all the normal map information in there and everything else, but the only thing missing is the lighting. Also, as you can see, I removed the rim light, so we have a pretty much even lighting from every perspective, because the rim light is something that we are going to add later on in Sketchfab. It's just it's just better that way. We don't want to have a rim light just shining at the back and you can't make out any shapes anymore. So just prepare the material that way. This is still the high poly mesh, and we have our low poly mesh, Sketchfab mesh, that we already used before on the side with UVs and everything. And what you can basically do is just apply like a simple bake material when you're using cycles, and just add an image node, make it active, and use the bake texture again. And then select all of this, make the low poly mesh the active one. And one little thing that you should keep in mind if you bake the entire render setup is the mesh, the low poly mesh that the lighting setup is going to be baked to should be above, the surface should be above all of the other meshes. So they are not going to be, if there are some intersecting points, those faces will be black. So keep that in mind. I just inflated the model a bit. If you look at this, all of these little patches that are penetrating the original mesh, these will be black because they are below the mesh that you are baking from, that you want the bake information from. So just go into edit mode, select everything, click Alt S, and then just scale along the normal just a bit. And then scale that up. I just made it as a separate shape key or blend shape, depending on which program you use. And just have it everything above the surface. And this should work. And then, yeah, have everything selected, have the image selected. And then you just click Bake. And you can just disable glossy right here. Everything else, you can still have that. Also subsurface, maybe not. Everything else, keep it in there, bake, and then wait for it all to go down. I'm not going to click it now because it's going to take some time, but it will take like a couple of minutes. But then you should have a baked texture. And also don't forget to crank up the samples and the render settings so that the baking is mostly noise-free. Another thing that you can use is to make the specular a bit more realistic. You could switch the original mesh that currently has this clay material. You can just apply like a simple gray diffuse shader. If I can just do that, just simple diffuse, and if I render that, with the lighting setup maybe. Alright, and then just make it 50% gray. Wait. This 0.5, make it 50% gray. And this is basically the same lighting setup, everything is still the same, but what you have here is just light and dark places that you can use. You can bake this as well and have it as a separate texture. Then in Photoshop or whatever 2D program, just make it black and white, increase the contrast a bit, and then you have a black and white mask of where the most reflective surfaces are. You won't get any reflections within these crevices. In these areas, no light will hit this place, so there are not going to be any reflections. So just bake this extra texture if you have some extra time. Bake it out, make it black and white, increase the contrast to pure, like use all the spectrum of black and white for this texture, and then plug it in as a specular map. And then you have like a specular mask where the light will hit. And this just gives this extra little realism to it. This is just a little tip, but we're not going to use it right now because, yeah, I just wanted to make this bit go along a bit faster. And yeah, just export it again, all the textures, of course. And that's pretty much it. I would, and you can, this entire setup with the materials and the lighting, you can reuse it for every model on a daily basis if you're making this for SculptJanuary, and just keep decimating the measure, the sculpt in the end, clean it up, then bake, then create a smart UV map, just like that. Bake in the normal information for missing details, and then bake in the lighting information without the specular. So if we go back to this model, if I move on to the 3D settings, I can show you how I did it, how I set up the materials. I have just this one material. I can just basically just pick up none in here, just no material here. And also, I mean, we can first like enable bump map, like normal maps, whatever you have there. But for the pre-made lighting setup, you can just plug in the texture, which I have here, but it basically will just give you some diffuse information. And then you go in this emission tab, turn it on, and plug in the same texture. And that's it. And this is what you have then without the specular. This is the purely baked lighting setup with like, okay, there's a bit of a reaction from the HDRI and the lights. But yeah, this is what you have in here. Also, little tip, because we have these ugly seams in here and everything else, just go in here and maybe set up different filtering, just maybe to bilinear, and that way just the scaling will work a bit differently. If I just try out which works best, because if you have it trilinear, for example, you zoom out way to the back and you can see all these ugly little seams. And if you have it to example bilinear or nearest, it just reduces it just a bit. Yeah, just keep that in mind. Also for the emission, don't, if you have this texture applied, don't plug it up to 100, because then it will just be a glowing lamp. Like all the whitest information will just glow and all the black information will just stay black. The best values usually are like from 6 to 8. Like the sweet spot usually is between something like 10 or 16, depending on how you have to be careful about the overblown white spots from the lighting setup. Just keep it and also don't make it too low, because then you don't get the intended effect anymore. And then the only thing that you need to add after that is just some extra specular. And also, this is what I mean, like if you don't have the extra specular map, I could just plug in technically just this in there, and you can really see the result already. This is how it should look. These areas wouldn't get any specular information, but if you have none there, it just looks like this, completely overblown with specularity. But just keep it in there. If you're lazy, just use this texture as well. It works. But yeah, just plug in this, give it some extra specularity, and that's it. And yeah, but the problem with this is it's not really adjusted very well. That's why these spots get so little specular animation, just because they are gray. So that's why you have to adjust the texture in Photoshop. Just make it more contrasting. Just bring out the lit areas much more, and the dark areas should stay dark. You can also plug in some extra maps like transparency, subsurface scattering, and also I created like some extra light setups, rim lights, 2 extra rim lights. Everything else is baked in anyway. Then extra HDRI to give some extra reflection information, but you don't have to do anything else for the lighting information. And in terms of textures, just go wild. Whatever you can do, you can add it in anyway. Just keep in mind that you don't want to bake the specularity or something like subsurface scattering or transparency into this emission map. This should just have the normal material information without these factors. And then just add these extra things in after that in Sketchfab, and it should work. Also, I added some extra post-processing, as you know, just because it was like with the emission map and then the extra HDRI, it sometimes tends to get a bit overblown. You can fix that with Filmic, but I specifically didn't want to use Filmic with this model because it completely destroys the look that I already rendered, that I already baked in. So I just wanted to keep that. And yeah, just also some color balancing, and that's it. And this is also the same thing that I did for this model. If I go into these 3D settings, the difference here is that I had a lot more different materials just to have like more texture information. I made a material for the body, the eyes, the hair, and just baked out separate textures for that to apply to. But yeah, if I go into this is just the baked information without the specular. Also, I have it in the emission map, and the emission as an emission map. And then I just added some extra rim lighting, an HDRI for reflections, some post-processing for extra ambient occlusion, sharpness, a vignette, bloom, and tone mapping, just a bit to give it a bit more saturation. And that's it. You can have this ready within maximum of an hour. Like, especially if you have already a system in place and can do it every day, you can make it so fast, and it's super easy. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Originally, I planned this tutorial more as a quick tip video, but I knew that the content already got bigger and bigger, and I knew from my last video that if I put too much content into it, okay, it will get overblown and 50 minutes long. And that's why I eventually split it into 2 parts and skipped some of the aspects of the workflow, like the materials I used, the lighting setup, and some of the other Sketchfab settings. I just wanted to have this video about the workflow of baking in the information that you need, getting the model ready to a point that you can upload and use it, and then setting up everything in Sketchfab to a point that you are really happy with it. So yeah, I hope this video inspired you, and if you're curious, check out SculptJanuary on Facebook. Also, SculptJanuary is now part of the Weekly CG Challenge group, which is a bi-weekly competition for all CG art, no matter if 2D, 3D, animation, or interactive. So maybe check out that if you're interested as well. And if you're interested in more of my work, visit my ArtStation profile or Facebook page. Yeah, and all of these informations, I will add them in the description below, so don't worry, you can all look it up. And yeah, I hope you liked it. And if you have some critique, feedback, whatever, just tell me in the comments and have fun.